A year and a half since civil war erupted in Sudan, the fighting continues to spread and there are no hopes of a ceasefire. In May, the US's Special Envoy for Sudan said up to 150,000 people had been killed, making the war the largest active conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. It started in April 2023 when fighting broke out between Sudan's armed forces, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and a paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces, led by Hamdan Hemeti Dagalo. The power struggle between the two men is for control of the state and its resources. International agencies say more than half of the population is facing acute hunger. More than 11 million people are internally displaced because of the fighting. Another 3 million have fled into neighboring countries such as Central African Republic, Egypt, Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Chad, where DW's Katarina Kroll and Maisoon Melhem sent this report from Adre, near the border with Sudan.
Mariam has reached the border to Chad, and with that, safety. It's clear she's been through a difficult ordeal to get here.
Thank God I made it this far. But I need security.
Around 150 people cross the border into Chad here every day. They're fleeing war-torn Sudan, where the struggle for power between two generals and their forces has left the country facing unimaginable violence, hunger and devastation. Mariam's first stop in Chad is the United Nations Refugee Agency, where she'll be registered for a future life in this new country. Today, Germany's development minister has come to the crossing, her aim to highlight how much aid Chad is contributing to refugees.
Any country would be overwhelmed by this number of refugees. No region, no country can cope alone. And that's why the international community must show solidarity here. It has to give more support to Chad.
Adre is a transit camp just inside Chad's border. It shows how desperately needed that support is. Plastic tarpaulins for the 230,000 people living here. From here, the refugees are meant to be taken inland to more permanent camps.
From the onset of the crisis, for us it's important that we find a way for them to create a new life and not just rely on emergency assistance. So very quickly we want to support the government and the HCR in helping refugees in new sites to create a new living instead of depending on monthly food assistance. So we want to help them cultivate land, cultivate vegetables that will create an income.
But Chad itself is one of the poorest countries in the world and is suffering massively from climate change. Severe flooding alternates with extreme droughts. In many places in the country, there's not enough for the bare necessities. Over 30% of people live in extreme poverty, without access to clean water and food. And now, more than 1 million refugees from Sudan need to be cared for here on top.
So that's very challenging in the sense that to find the land and set the camps where there is no infrastructure at all. So we have to build completely from scratch to host more than 50,000 people per camp. And that's expensive. We lack resources for that. As you know, we are underfunded. The refugee response plan is financed at the 29% level only, which is not enough to provide a dignified living condition to refugees.
1,000 kilometers from the border in the capital N'Djamena. Here, Svenja Schulze promises Chad's foreign minister 57 million euros in support from Germany for long-term crisis aid. The refugees from Sudan are Chad's brothers and sisters, he says.
We don't want refugees to be seen as a burden in our country, but as an economic opportunity.
Chad has a tough authoritarian leadership that has close ties with the former colonial power France, but the government is also looking for new partners, such as Russia and Turkey. It is all about money and influence. There are reports that the United Arab Emirates are supplying weapons to Sudan via Chad and thus fueling the war. The foreign minister denies that.
I personally don't know of any country that supplies weapons there, and if I knew, I would testify here before God that I would say so.
Germany's development minister appeals to all sides.
It is absolutely clear, and there are international treaties that everyone has signed, that no weapons should be supplied to war zones. And that is what we are appealing to, that the war here can stop.
For Mariam, peace is the biggest hope.
Everyone is on the run. I hope that Sudan will be like it was before the war, so that we can return.
But it is likely that they will all have to wait a long time before they can return home.
The head of one of the biggest humanitarian NGOs has criticized the international community for neglecting the war in Sudan. Here is what Jan Egeland from the Norwegian Refugee Council had to say.
It's the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet, Sudan. Biggest hunger crisis, biggest displacement crisis, 14 million people fleeing their homes. And the world is giving it a shrug. I mean, the world is neglecting what's happening here. Of course, there is attention to two crises, Ukraine and the Middle East. But the largest crisis on earth is neglected. I cannot fathom why. I think it will come to haunt us. And also too little pressure on these parties to end the senseless conflict among themselves, where these men with guns and power are willing to tear down their own house and their own civilization and fight each other to the last child and the last woman.
And I'm joined here in studio by Germany's Minister for Economic Development, Svenja Schulze, who you saw in that report. She's just returned from Chad. Minister, welcome to DW News Africa. It's really good to have you here. We appreciate you coming in. We've heard that this is the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet right now. The scale of this is just astonishing. I wonder if you could just share with us some of your impressions, having returned, seeing the impact that this war is having. What is it that you told your colleagues in the German cabinet? What is the message you brought back home?
First of all, it was really heartbreaking to see all the refugees on the border. The Chad is one of the poorest countries of the world, and they opened the doors for all the refugees from Sudan. And we see mostly women and children. And it was so heartbreaking because we can see what experience they had on the way from Sudan to Chad. They all experienced violence in a really hard way. And that the Chad is so solidarity, has such a lot of solidarity with these refugees. That is something we should be aware of. The world should see that. And I think it is one of the tasks of a development minister like I am, from a very rich country, to highlight the situation and to make the world see what is happening in Chad, what is happening in Sudan.
Yeah. What is happening in Sudan is effectively two generals fighting over power, holding an entire country hostage. And then we have an international system that seemingly isn't responding to that. I mean, on the part of NGOs, they see this as it's being ignored to an extent. Are rich countries like Germany ignoring this crisis in a world where you have war in the Middle East, war in Europe? Is Sudan just not a priority?
Sudan is a priority, and we do a lot to help to deal with that conflict and to make the pressure on the two groups to stop the war. We do a conference in Paris together with France and the EU. We organized a pressure on a meeting with the foreign ministers. But the world needs to see what has happened there and need to do more pressure on the parties there, because the consequences are so hard to the people. Most of the people who are affected are normal farmers, are the population there, and that needs to stop. And therefore, we need the international community to take more awareness to these heartbreaking situations.
Awareness, but also there are calls for all countries to immediately seize direct and indirect supplies of arms and ammunition to the warring parties in Sudan. That's something that you support. What is Germany doing in this regard? You know, Amnesty International, an investigation earlier in November found that there are also French-made weapon systems being used in the war in Sudan.
I hear of this report, and that is why we bring together in Paris, for example, all the neighboring countries, all the countries who we need on the table. And we had an agreement, principles, who said that we don't deliver weapons to these parties in a war. And that needs to be done now, because if the international community stops to deliver weapons, that will help in that war. And these principles that we agreed about in Paris, and the foreign ministers agreed about that, that is an important step forward, but now it needs to take into account that there are these principles and that is important.
But just a final word for the situation in Sudan, and where is there hope for people in Sudan, for the young men and women who are living this horror?
Seeing all the solidarity that is coming from Chad, seeing what such a poor country is doing for the refugees, I think that should be an argument for the rest of the world to take more awareness of this heartbreaking situation. It is needed that the pressure from the world goes to the two parts of the conflict in Sudan, of the war in Sudan, and make pressure that they stop that, because it is hard to see what that means to the people.
Minister Svenja Schulze, we appreciate you being on DW News Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.